3 beasts were stamped permanent F rank, and Kieran Voss was judged even worse. Crownspire called him Zero-Bond, a tamer candidate with supposedly no usable soul. Yet one abandoned salamander will evolve beyond the Academy's entire ranking chart. And the reason is not a legendary contract, bloodline cheat, or lucky system reward. Kieran never forces a single beast to obey him, even when survival demands power. Instead, he touches the memories everyone else wanted buried and lets them choose. That choice will crack Vareth's ranking system and put Apex Syndicate on his trail. That is today's story. Now rewind to the day Crownspire branded Kieran a failure. Crownspire Academy rises above Vareth's capital like a fortress built for legends. Its black towers carry statues of ancient tamers riding primordial beasts into war. For generations, graduating here meant status, money, and access to elite contracts. For Kieran Voss, graduation morning feels more like a public execution with uniforms. He stands among 100 candidates inside the Academy's residence hall. Crystal pylons circle the chamber, glowing whenever a human soul matches a beast. Rows of cages wait behind reinforced glass, each holding a certified Academy beast. Most are healthy, trained, and already ranked from D rank through rare B rank. One by one, students place their hands against the central soul prism. The prism reads compatibility, then opens the cage of the best matching beast. A blonde student named Lucas Vane steps forward, wearing a smug half-smile. Lucas comes from a wealthy tamer family with 3 licensed hunters in Parliament. The soul prism flashes bright gold before his palm even settles completely. A red-maned stormhound slams against its gate, barking like it chose royalty. The examiner announces an 87% resonance rate, unusually high for rookies. The hall erupts, and Lucas drinks in the applause without pretending otherwise. He glances at Kieran afterward, making sure Zero-Bond saw the whole flex. Before Kieran takes his final shot, if Monster Evolution recaps are your thing, hit like and subscribe. Because this exam does not give him a beast. It sends him toward 3 nobody wanted. Kieran ignores him and rubs the scar hidden beneath his left glove. He has taken this exam 6 times across 3 years of Academy training. Every result has been the same ugly number staring back at him. 0.0 measurable soul resonance with every registered beast tested. Some instructors think his soul is damaged from birth or the Sundering's fallout. Others quietly call him soul dead, a person evolution itself forgot to include. Kieran never believed either explanation, but belief does not change a scoreboard. Candidate after candidate forms a contract while his turn keeps crawling closer. A nervous girl bonds with a moss stag and starts crying from relief. Another student gets rejected twice before a copper drake finally accepts him. Even failed matches create some response, a flicker, pulse, or defensive growl. Only Kieran produces absolute silence, which somehow feels worse than rejection. Instructor Mara Kell calls his name, and whispers ripple instantly through the hall. Kieran walks toward the prism while Lucas folds his arms near the front row. Mara tells him this is the final certification attempt allowed under Academy policy. Kieran already knows, because he read that sentence until sunrise last night. He presses his bare palm against the cold crystal and waits for anything. Nothing happens. No light travels through the prism, and no cage reacts behind the glass. Mara adjusts the calibration and orders the technicians to run a second sweep. The machine hums louder, scanning neural rhythm, soul pressure, and contract affinity. The result returns exactly the same, an empty bar beneath Kieran's name. Someone laughs in the back row before trying unsuccessfully to disguise it. Lucas does not bother disguising his reaction and mutters that even trash has stats. Mara shoots him a warning look, but the damage lands exactly as intended. Kieran keeps his hand on the prism for several seconds longer than necessary. He remembers being 12, watching his mother polish an old tamer badge. He remembers promising that one day his own beast would stand beside him. He remembers every instructor saying hard work could compensate for weak talent. Apparently nobody planned for a student whose talent score refused to exist. Mara finally tells him to step away from the testing platform. Her voice stays professional, but pity makes the words cut even deeper. Under Crownspire rules, Kieran cannot graduate as a licensed combat tamer. He may apply for beast logistics, records management, or stable maintenance instead. Lucas whispers that sweeping cages sounds perfect for somebody with 0 aggro. This time several students laugh openly, and Kieran finally looks at him. He says Lucas should enjoy the hound while it still likes his personality. A few students choke back laughs, and Lucas's grin disappears for 1 second. It is a tiny win, but Kieran knows the bigger battle is already over. Mara hands him a black withdrawal seal marking his dismissal from combat training. The hall doors open, and Kieran walks out before anyone can offer sympathy. Rain hits the academy courtyard hard enough to blur the statues above him. Kieran stuffs the seal into his pocket and heads toward the south gate. He has no plan beyond leaving before the graduation ceremony begins at noon. That is when a metal clang echoes from a service corridor beneath the kennels. Kieran stops because the sound comes again, followed by a weak rasping hiss. The corridor is marked Restricted Disposal Wing, which immediately sounds like bad news. He should keep walking, but curiosity has always been his least practical trait. Kieran follows the noise downstairs, where the polished academy stone turns rough. The air smells of antiseptic, wet fur, old ash, and industrial cleaning solution. At the bottom, he finds cages lined beneath harsh white maintenance lights. These are not the beasts shown to applicants in the bright residence hall. Many have scars, missing limbs, damaged cores, or labels stamped rejected. Some are recovering before transfer to sanctuaries outside Crownspire's budget system. Others are scheduled for euthanasia because nobody will pay their upkeep. Kieran's jaw tightens as he reads the colored tags hanging from each door. A maintenance worker named Tomas Rook notices him and immediately starts complaining. Tomas says dismissed students are not supposed to wander inside disposal corridors. Kieran asks what made the noise, pretending he did not hear the first part. Tomas points toward the final cage without looking especially interested. Inside sits a salamander barely longer than Kieran's forearm, dark red and underweight. Half its tail is missing, ending in a knot of badly healed scar tissue. Its scales look dull, and every breath leaks a weak spark from its mouth. The cage label reads Ember, Fire Salamander, Permanent F rank, Contract Failure 6 times. A second warning underneath says Aggressive when handled near damaged tail region. Kieran crouches, and Ember immediately presses itself against the rear cage wall. Its eyes track his hands with the focus of something expecting pain. Tomas says the little guy has bitten 3 handlers and torched 1 clipboard. Kieran says destroying paperwork might be the beast's strongest documented skill. Tomas almost laughs, then remembers they are discussing an animal scheduled for death. He explains Ember was bred from a minor volcanic salamander line near Redfall. The clutch produced 8 healthy juveniles and 1 malformed runt with no tail flame. Without a tail flame, the species cannot regulate stored heat efficiently. That makes Ember weaker, slower, and prone to dangerous internal temperature spikes. In other words, the beast has a broken build before the tutorial even starts. Kieran hates how natural the joke feels because it sounds painfully familiar. Ember lets out another warning hiss when he shifts closer to the bars. Kieran stops moving and lowers his hand, instead of reaching through immediately. He tells Ember quietly that he is not here to test anything. The salamander obviously cannot understand every word, but its eyes stop darting. Kieran notices a thin metal restraint rubbing against the scar near its tail. He asks Tomas why the damaged area is still strapped so tightly. Tomas says veterinary staff use the brace to prevent reopening during stress episodes. Kieran points out the brace is clearly causing half those stress episodes itself. Tomas shrugs and says nobody wants to sedate an F rank twice daily. That answer makes Kieran angrier than Lucas's insults ever managed. Upstairs, he asks whether he can loosen the strap under staff supervision. Tomas refuses at first because Ember bites anyone touching that side. Kieran answers that getting bitten would still beat graduation morning by a mile. Tomas studies him, sighs, and unlocks the outer safety latch. He warns Kieran to pull back the second Ember flares its throat sac. Kieran kneels slowly and slides one hand through the narrow maintenance opening. Ember bears tiny black teeth and curls around its injured side. Kieran does not aim for the brace. He places his palm flat on the cage floor several inches away. For almost a minute, neither human nor beast moves anything except their eyes. Then Ember inches forward, suspicious enough to stop after every tiny step. Its nose touches the edge of Kieran's fingers. The world disappears. Heat slams through Kieran's skull like somebody opened a furnace behind his eyes. He tries to pull back, but his body no longer exists inside the sensation. Images replace the corridor, sharp enough to feel like stolen memories. He sees Ember as a hatchling buried beneath stronger siblings beneath warming lamps. Handlers lift the healthy salamanders first, while the runt keeps slipping underneath them. A breeder marks Ember's chart with a red defect symbol beside tail development. The scene changes, and an eager young tamer chooses Ember for cheap training credits. The boy pushes it through fire drills designed for beasts twice its size. Every failure earns a harder command. Another stimulant, another burst of forced heat. Kieran feels Ember's terror as its injured tail begins burning from inside. The young tamer keeps shouting because the contract mark says obedience should work. Then something tears. Pain explodes through Ember's body, and the memory becomes blinding white. Kieran hears a scream that might belong to the beast or himself. When vision returns, half the salamander's tail is gone across a scorched floor. The young tamer stares at the wound, not with horror, but disappointment. He tells an instructor the beast is useless and requests a replacement immediately. Ember is moved from clinic to kennel, then kennel to failed contract storage. Different hands keep grabbing it, measuring it, testing it, and returning it. Each time the cage closes, the same lesson becomes harder inside its mind. Humans only touch you when they want something your body cannot give. Then the memory buckles, and the soul thread pulls faintly in the opposite direction. Ember does not receive Kieran's past. Only broken impressions leak through the contact. A cold hospital room, a metal badge, and the silence of another failed prism. The fragments vanish before Ember can understand names, dates, or what they mean. What remains is simpler. Kieran knows exactly how abandonment feels. Ember answers with its own fear, and the two emotions overlap without permission. Neither sees the other's full story, yet the recognition between them is unmistakable. Kieran jerks his hand back and crashes onto the corridor floor. Tomas curses and grabs the emergency suppressant hanging beside the cage. Kieran tells him not to use it because Ember never attacked him. The salamander is still sitting near the open, eyes wider than before. Its throat sac glows once, then fades without producing a defensive flame. Tomas asks what happened, and Kieran genuinely has no useful answer. He says he saw something, but even that sounds completely insane aloud. Crownspire tested him for years, yet nobody ever mentioned memory transfer during contact. Tomas checks the corridor camera and confirms no contract mark appeared anywhere. Kieran's wrist remains bare, exactly like every other failed bonding attempt. Still, a faint silver thread seems to shimmer between his fingers and Ember. It vanishes whenever he looks directly at it, like light under moving water. Kieran asks when Ember is scheduled for transfer out of Crownspire. Tomas does not answer immediately, which tells him the situation is worse. The tag actually means disposal at sunset, not relocation to a sanctuary. Ember has too many failed contracts and too little market value to justify treatment. Kieran asks whether an unlicensed student can legally claim a rejected F rank. Tomas laughs once and says only a lunatic would want that paperwork. Then he adds that, technically, yes, Academy rejects can be released privately. The new owner assumes all medical cost and liability without Academy support. Kieran says perfect, because apparently terrible financial decisions are free after expulsion. Tomas warns him that Ember has no verified growth path beyond juvenile salamander. The beast's core is unstable, and its tail defect blocks standard evolution requirements. Kieran looks at Ember and remembers the boy abandoning it after the injury. He refuses to become another person who decides value from a damaged stat sheet. Tomas brings over a transfer slate and makes Kieran sign 17 liability clauses. One asks whether he understands F-rank beasts may never become combat viable. Kieran signs that box the fastest. Then Tomas opens the cage fully and steps back behind a protective shield. Kieran expects Ember to bolt down the corridor. The second freedom appears. Instead, the salamander stays inside with its body pressed against the floor. Too many open doors in its memories. Ended with another test waiting outside. Kieran kneels several feet away and turns his back deliberately. He tells Ember the cage is open, and nothing is attached to the choice. If it wants to leave through the drainage exit, Kieran will not stop it. If it wants food, there is dried ashfish inside his coat pocket. If it wants to bite him, he would prefer the left hand today. Tomas mutters that this is not recognized tamer methodology in any textbook. Kieran says textbooks were doing amazing work for him until this morning. Minutes pass before tiny claws scrape against the cage threshold behind him. Ember takes one step outside, then freezes like the floor might punish it. Kieran still does not turn around. Another scrape follows, then another, and a warm weight touches his boot. When he finally looks down, Ember is sitting against his ankle. No contract seal appears. No soul prism flashes. The beast simply chooses not to leave. That decision hits Kieran harder than any academy certification ever could. Tomas watches the pair and says this whole thing feels above his pay grade. Kieran agrees, scoops the paperwork, and starts walking toward the service exit. Ember follows 3 steps behind instead of allowing itself to be carried. They almost reach the stairs before another cage rattles violently to their left. Something black and small slams into the bars, then vanishes into shadow. Kieran stops, and Ember arches with the warning chirp toward the dark cage. The label reads, Vex, Shadow Hair, Partial Blindness, Permanent F rank. A rabbit-shaped beast crouches inside with charcoal fur and one clouded eye. Its healthy eye never focuses on Kieran's face for more than a heartbeat. Instead, its ears rotate constantly, mapping footsteps, breathing, and distant machinery. Tomas says Vex was found near the eastern ruins after attacking a survey drone. Nobody knows its exact breeding line because its core signature keeps shifting. 3 contract attempts failed after Vex panicked inside resonance restraint equipment. The final attempt ended when it slipped through a handler's shadow and escaped. They caught it 2 floors down after the beast collapsed from core exhaustion. Kieran asks whether slipping through shadows is normal for an F-rank hair. Tomas says absolutely not, but unstable abilities can still be useless abilities. Vex gives a low clicking sound the moment Kieran moves toward its door. Ember answers with a softer chirp, and surprisingly, Vex quiets down. Kieran notices the 2 cages carry tags from the same rejected intake week. Maybe the beasts already know each other's scent from the disposal wing. He reaches toward Vex's bars, but stops before making contact this time. After Ember, blindly touching another traumatized beast feels like a spectacularly bad plan. Kieran places a piece of ashfish near the opening and waits instead. Vex ignores the food, but tracks Ember's movements with its working eye. Ember walks forward, sniffs the offering, then deliberately backs away. Only after that does Vex creep close enough to steal the food instantly. Kieran smiles, because trust apparently comes with a witness requirement. Tomas tells him not to get ambitious, because one liability monster is enough. Kieran asks whether Vex is also scheduled for disposal at sunset. The silence returns. He exhales through his nose and asks Tomas for another transfer slate. Tomas stares at him like Zero-Bond has become zero common sense instead. Kieran signs anyway, though Vex gives no sign of accepting him personally. When the cage opens, Vex immediately darts behind a storage crate. Tomas says there goes his second bad investment before ownership even starts. Kieran shrugs and begins walking again, with Ember following his heel. After 10 steps, a tiny shadow moves along the wall beside them. Vex emerges from it farther ahead, freezes, and pretends this was accidental. Kieran decides not to call the bluff. The third beast finds him before he finds the third beast. A deep metallic thunk sounds from a lower pen near the loading ramp. Something heavy is repeatedly trying to stand and failing against the concrete. Inside sits a steel tortoise nearly as wide as a dinner table. Its shell is fractured across the center like stone struck by a hammer. One plate hangs lower than the others, exposing damaged metal tissue underneath. The label says Atlas, Steel Tortoise, Severe Shell Fracture, Permanent F rank. Unlike Ember and Vex, Atlas does not react defensively when Kieran approaches. It simply tries to stand again, slides, and slams onto one knee. Then it tries again. Kieran watches the cycle repeat until it becomes painful to witness. Tomas explains, Atlas belonged to a licensed caravan tamer 3 months ago. During a Ravager attack, Atlas held a bridge while civilians crossed behind it. The beast took repeated impacts from something ranked 2 ranks above itself. Its shell cracked, but the bridge stayed open long enough for everyone else. The owner survived and filed Atlas as a total combat loss the next morning. Repairing the shell would cost more than buying a healthier defensive beast. Kieran looks at the paperwork and asks whether the owner even visited afterward. Tomas shakes his head. Something cold settles behind Kieran's ribs. He kneels near Atlas and places both palms visibly on his own knees. The tortoise finally stops trying to stand and turns one dull silver eye toward him. Kieran says he has no idea whether Atlas wants another human around. He also says he will not pretend the shell can be fixed cheaply. But if the beast wants out of this building, Kieran can manage that much. Atlas's head lowers until its chin touches the floor. Kieran slowly extends one hand toward the shell's unbroken front plate. The moment his fingers touch metal, another memory slams open. Rain pours over a narrow suspension bridge, shaking under panicked footsteps. Atlas stands in the center while a horned ravager tears at its defense field. Each impact sends fractures crawling farther across the shell. Behind Atlas, frightened families run toward the far side without looking back. Its tamer screams commands from safety, ordering it to hold 3 seconds longer. 3 seconds become 10, then 20, then another impossible hit. Atlas feels the shell break, but refuses to move because children are still crossing. The final family reaches safety, and Atlas collapses with nothing left. Kieran expects pride inside the memory. What he feels instead is relief that everyone behind it survived. The scene cuts to a clinic, where Atlas hears its owner discussing replacement prices. The tamer never comes inside the treatment room. Atlas waits beside the door until sunset anyway. That patient loyalty hurts Kieran in a different place than Ember's fear. Then a faint emotional echo crosses the soul thread in the opposite direction. Atlas sees no scene, only Kieran's shame, stubbornness, and fear of being discarded. The connection breaks before either side understands how much actually passed between them. Atlas has not moved, but one massive claw now rests over Kieran's shoe. A second silver thread flickers from Kieran's wrist toward the cracked shell. This one remains visible for almost 2 full seconds. Tomas notices it too, and finally stops joking. He asks Kieran what exactly happened when he touched these beasts. Kieran says he wishes he knew, because this is not any contract he studied. Tomas checks Kieran's wrist again, and finds no registered soul mark. Academy doctrine says a beast cannot follow battle commands without a formal bond. Yet Ember is watching Kieran like it already understands his breathing patterns. Vex is still hiding in shadows, but its ears remain aimed toward his voice. Atlas pushes itself upright once more, this time using Kieran's leg for balance. Kieran looks at all 3 rejected tags hanging from the cage doors. Then he asks Tomas how many transfer forms he has left. Tomas looks at the 3 rejected beasts and rubs both temples slowly. He says Kieran is either compassionate, suicidal, or building the worst raid party alive. Kieran answers that after today, all 3 options feel completely possible. The paperwork takes another hour because Atlas requires a reinforced transport waiver. Vex technically refuses every ownership scan by stepping out of the reader's shadow. Eventually, Tomas lists Vex as voluntary companion pending independent resonance evaluation. That classification barely exists, but apparently Crownspire has forms for everything. By noon, Kieran walks through the south gate carrying 3 rejected ownership seals. Graduation bells ring behind him while decorated tamer teams parade across the plaza. Students pose beside shiny new beasts beneath banners displaying their starting ranks. Kieran leaves through the maintenance road with Ember walking beside his boot. Vex follows from rooftop shadows, appearing only when nobody looks directly upward. Atlas lumbers behind them on a borrowed cargo harness because its shell still hurts. No crowd cheers for this team. Kieran decides that makes 4 things they have in common already. His apartment sits above a closed herbal shop in Verith's lower market district. Inside, Ember immediately crawls beneath the iron stove and refuses to come out. This is not exactly the legendary tamer life sold in Academy recruitment posters. Still, the tiny room feels different once all 3 beasts occupy it. He does not attempt another memory bond that night. After what happened downstairs, forcing contact feels like violating something sacred. Instead, he studies their medical sheets while eating cold noodles from a paper cup. Ember's file says weak core retention, poor tail regulation, 0 evolution probability. Vex's says unstable shadow affinity, sensory defect, aggression risk, unknown adult form. Atlas's says permanent structural damage, reduced defense capacity, elution pathway compromised. On paper, the party looks like a completely broken bill. Kieran writes 3 words across the top of every file anyway. Start from strengths. When morning comes, the dish is empty, and Ember sleeps beside his boot. Atlas has somehow wedged itself across the doorway like an armored security system. The laugh fades when he sees 3 medical invoices waiting beneath yesterday's transfer seals. Ember needs thermal stabilizer, Vex needs eye drops, and Atlas requires reinforced sealant every morning. Kieran checks his savings and realizes Compassion has absolutely terrible short-term cash flow. He considers selling his mother's old tamer badge, then closes the drawer without touching it. Instead, he starts converting the apartment into something halfway safe for 3 strange companions. None of the upgrades looks professional, but everyone solves a problem the Academy ignored. Ember watches Kieran work and eventually drags one loose brick toward the stove by itself. By afternoon, the room already feels less like temporary storage and more like shared territory. He starts keeping a separate notebook for appetite, sleep, pain, temperature, and emotional triggers instead. Ember eats less after stressful contact, yet needs mineral salt after any serious flame output. Vex ignores food placed in exposed light, but eats normally once the bowl enters shadow. Atlas consistently gives away the best pieces whenever another beast finishes its portion early. That instinct to protect clearly survived everything the previous owner put the tortoise through. Later, Kieran wakes from a nap because something warm is pressing against his scarred left hand. Ember has curled around the wrist that touched its memories inside Crownspire's disposal wing. The silver thread between them appears briefly, brighter than it did during the first contact. This time no traumatic memory crashes into Kieran's mind, and no panic follows the connection. He receives only a warm impression that feels suspiciously close to safety. Kieran sends the feeling back without trying to shape it into a command. Ember's eyes close again, and the thread fades naturally instead of snapping apart. Kieran writes one new line beneath all 3 medical charts before going back to sleep. Trust is measurable too, even if Crownspire never built a machine capable of reading it. By morning, trust has to survive contact with a less emotional problem, money. Kieran needs food, medicine, and somewhere 3 damaged beasts can train safely. Licensed tamer contracts are close to him, so low-risk guild labor is his only option. His first job sends the team into an abandoned grain warehouse crawling with needle rats. The guild clerk notices Kieran's blank contract wrist and charges an ugly liability deposit. Inside, Kieran almost gives a textbook formation command before catching himself midway. These 3 do not need academy rolls forced onto bodies already carrying damage. Vex hears movement beneath the floorboards before anyone else detects the rats. Ember tracks their heat through cracks while Atlas automatically guards Kieran's blind side. The rolls are already there. Kieran only needs to stop getting in their way. Vex slips into shadow and flushes the first pack toward the open aisle. Ember answers with one short crimson burst, stopping before its core overheats. Atlas angles the intact shell plate and redirects flying quills into the wall. The first wave collapses without Atlas tanking a single direct impact. Ember fires only when the lane clears, and Atlas protects without blocking the shot. The warehouse job ends far faster than the owner expected from 3F ranks. When asked their real rank, Kieran says Crownspire considers all 3 bottom tier. The owner studies the clean battlefield and decides Crownspire's board needs new glasses. Kieran spends the reduced payout on shell sealant, stable food, and shadowroot supplements. None of it is flashy, but every purchase answers a weakness the academy ignored. Over the next 2 weeks, tiny guild jobs become field tests for the whole party. They clear greenhouse burrowers, escort herbalists, and recover cargo from collapsed tunnels. Each job confirms a pattern hidden beneath Crownspire's polished stat sheets. Ember overheats fastest from fear, not simply from producing large amounts of fire. Vex navigates better through sound and soul presence than damaged vision ever allowed. Atlas cannot absorb heavy impacts anymore, but angled armor can redirect them safely. Ember practices short bursts, learning that stopping early now counts as success. Its flames shrink but grow denser, shifting from scattered orange toward controlled crimson. Vex runs dark tunnels by sound alone, while moving bells become a readable map. Atlas practices meeting swinging weights off-center instead of sacrificing its cracked shell. For the first time, improvement means adapting around damage instead of pretending it vanished. And that new philosophy slowly changes how all 4 of them see weakness. Atlas still freezes whenever someone moves behind its cracked shell during practice. Kieran responds by sitting beside the beast instead of hiding behind its shell. He wants Atlas to learn partnership, not sacrifice as a default setting. One evening, a violent summer storm traps the whole group inside the rail depot. Thunder makes Ember flare, and sudden flashes send Vex scrambling between shadows. Atlas immediately wedges itself between both frightened beasts and the open doorway. Kieran sits on the floor in the middle without giving a single command. After several minutes, Ember crawls against one side of his leg. Vex appears against the other, ears flattened from thunder. Atlas settles behind them like a cracked steel wall. For a moment, nobody needs to improve anything. They simply stay together until the storm passes. The next morning, Ember responds to Vex's warning click before Kieran reacts. Vex shifts behind Atlas during a falling beam drill without needing a cue. Atlas angles its shell specifically to leave Ember a clean firing lane. Their teamwork is becoming something beyond individual conditioning. Kieran starts sensing faint emotional impressions through the silver threads during fights. Not words, and not full memories. More like flashes of danger, intent, pain, and trust shared across distance. The phenomenon should be impossible without registered contract marks. Before returning to Crownspire, one canal job gives Kieran a different kind of test. A juvenile glassfin serpent is trapped beneath a floodgate while licensed handlers close in. Kieran opens the downstream grate, pulls Atlas back, and lets Ember remain calmly visible. Instead of touching the frightened beast, he tosses food toward open water and waits. Ember steps backward first, and the glassfin finally chooses the escape route for itself. One worker complains they could have sold it. Kieran says removal never meant ownership. Warm approval travels from Ember through the soul thread, stronger than any training reward. Kieran writes one word beneath every companion's notes that night: choice. If modern ranks cannot measure that change, older Tamer records might explain why. The next morning, Kieran returns to Crownspire's public archives wearing a hood. The Academy receptionist recognizes Zero-Bond anyway, and looks immediately uncomfortable. Kieran asks for pre-sundering records about non-marked beast partnerships. She says those archives require faculty authorization or an active research license. Kieran points out he used to be a student yesterday. She says that is not how authorization works, which feels unnecessarily literal. Before he can argue further, instructor Mara Kell appears from the archive stairwell. She looks at Ember beside his boot, then at Vex's shadow behind him. Her expression changes when Atlas squeezes through the front door afterward. Mara asks why Kieran appears to be collecting Crownspire's rejected inventory. Kieran says somebody had to draft the league's worst fantasy roster. Mara does not smile, but her eyes soften slightly, despite herself. Then she notices Ember respond when Kieran's fingers twitch near his side. No spoken command passes between them. Ember simply shifts position and watches the entrance automatically. Mara's attention snaps toward Kieran's bare wrist. She asks whether he somehow obtained an illegal third-party contract seal. Kieran says there is still no seal, and that is exactly why he came. Mara brings Kieran into a side examination room away from curious students. She orders Ember onto a diagnostic pad and runs a standard bond scan. The screen confirms no contract mark, no compulsion seal, and no ownership resonance. Yet Ember's stress level drops whenever Kieran steps closer to the platform. Mara repeats the test with Vex, which refuses the platform completely. Kieran asks Vex to circle the room instead, expecting nothing more than cooperation. The hair melts through a chair's shadow and reappears behind Mara's desk. Mara stares at the movement trace like somebody just broke basic arithmetic. That ability should require a stable D-rank shadow core at minimum. Vex's core still reads F rank on every instrument available. Atlas creates an even stranger result when its shell enters the scanner. The machine flags severe damage, then detects unusually dense defensive essence underneath. Mara reruns the measurement twice before quietly shutting the screen off. Kieran asks whether Crownspire's F-rank labels might simply be wrong. Mara says ranking systems are imperfect, but not usually wrong 3 times together. Then Kieran tells her what happened when he touched each beast. He explains the memories, the shared pain, and the silver threads afterward. Mara listens without interrupting until he describes Ember seeing his memories back. That detail finally makes her sit down. She asks whether Kieran has ever heard the phrase reciprocal soul imprinting. Kieran says no, because Crownspire mostly taught contracts, commands, and combat law. Mara says that is because reciprocal imprinting appears only in pre-sundering documents. Modern Tamer bonds work through reinforced contract channels controlled by the human side. Ancient records describe something older, voluntary, and dangerously difficult to measure. Those records call it soul bonding. Kieran feels the words land before he fully understands what they imply. Mara warns him not to get excited because historical accounts are fragmented mythology. Most were written before standardized rankings or reproducible resonance technology existed. Still, the behavior of Kieran's beasts does not fit modern contract models. She gives him temporary access to one restricted archive shelf under supervision. Kieran spends hours reading damaged field journals from before the sundering. The journals describe tamers forming bonds without visible ownership marks. Some beasts supposedly chose companions after shared dreams, memories, or life-threatening experiences. One text says true resonance cannot be imposed because both souls must open willingly. Another warns that forcing such contact can destroy both minds involved. Kieran reads that sentence 3 times and immediately thinks about void-like pain flashes. Another page shows silver threads linking human and beast silhouettes. The symbol resembles what he saw beside Ember's cage almost perfectly, but every record stops around the era of the Sundering. After that catastrophe, voluntary soul bonds disappear from documented Tamer history. Contract marks replace them within a generation because they are safer and controllable. Kieran asks Mara why nobody teaches any of this in first-year history. She says modern Verith prefers reliable systems over legends nobody can reproduce. Then she adds something that bothers him more. Crownspire's original founders considered soul bonding stronger than contract resonance when successful. The bond could supposedly deepen as human and beast understood each other. It also allowed shared instinct across multiple companions without constant verbal commands. Kieran immediately thinks about the railyard training and the storm afterward. Mara notices his expression and tells him not to test theories recklessly. Kieran promises nothing because reckless testing is basically his only affordable laboratory. Before leaving, Mara gives him a handwritten address instead of another archive book. It belongs to Dr. Elias Ward, a retired beast path researcher near the East Wall. Mara says Ward was expelled from Crownspire research circles for challenging ranking doctrine. That recommendation sounds either perfect or catastrophically suspicious. Kieran takes it anyway. Outside the archive, Lucas Vane waits beside his newly bonded Stormhound. He sees Kieran's 3 rejects and asks whether the junkyard started issuing companions. Kieran ignores him until the hound growls at Ember and crowds Vex's damaged side. A sudden snap near Vex's blind eye triggers panic before anyone can de-escalate. Vex drops through shadow and reappears beneath the hound by pure instinct. The startled C-rank predator tears free from Lucas and lunges after the moving shadow. Atlas reaches Vex first, despite its damaged shell, and plants sideways across the corridor. Instead of tanking head-on, the tortoise angles its strongest plate at impact. The hound glances away and skids harmlessly across the academy training mats. Ember lays a concentrated heat line across the floor, stopping another charge. Cold, Vex emerges behind Atlas and chooses cover instead of turning panic into aggression. The whole exchange ends before academy guards can even reach the corridor. Students stare at Kieran's F ranks like their stat screens just lied in public. Lucas blames Kieran, but Mara arrives and points toward the security cameras overhead. Kieran checks Vex first. The hair stays close instead of fleeing from his hands. That small piece of trust matters more than embarrassing Lucas ever could. Mara studies Atlas and asks who taught the tortoise to redirect impact. Kieran says Atlas did, once somebody stopped demanding it absorb everything head-on. Mara warns that unusual performance attracts attention faster than ordinary success. Kieran asks whether that warning is supposed to sound ominous. She says successful tamers in Verith eventually learn to assume attention is ominous. That evening, Kieran follows Mara's address to Dr. Elias Ward's strange little laboratory. Ward's home looks like an herb shop collided with the forbidden laboratory. Preserved beast cores line dusty shelves beside cages containing harmless glow beetles. An elderly man with wild gray hair opens the door, carrying 3 magnifying lenses. He recognizes Mara's handwriting and immediately tells Kieran to come inside. Ward refuses to skin the beasts first. Instead, he asks Kieran how each one behaves when frightened. The question surprises Kieran because researchers usually begin with rank or core density. He explains Ember's overheating, Vex's sensory panic, and Atlas's protective freezing. Ward asks what Kieran changed during training. Kieran says he stopped correcting the traits the beasts used to survive trauma. Ward smiles. Like that answer confirmed something he hoped to hear. He examines Ember's missing tail and finds old thermal channels scarred near the base. The channels are damaged, but not completely dead like Crownspire's report claimed. Heat is rerouting through Ember's spine instead of exiting normally through the tail. Ward calls it inefficient, dangerous, and potentially very interesting. Kieran asks whether interesting means fixable. Ward says fixable is the wrong question if the body already chose another solution. That line sticks inside Kieran's head immediately. Next, Ward studies Vex's shadow signature in a room with controlled lighting. Vex's damaged eye reacts poorly, but its soul sense spikes before every light change. Ward suspects the beast compensates by detecting living essence instead of visual movement. That would explain how Vex navigates darkness far better than its classification suggests. Finally, Ward taps Atlas's cracked shell with a tuning fork. Each fracture carries vibration across separate plates, rather than straight through the center. The break reduced raw durability, but created multiple independent resonance channels. Ward mutters that nature has a rude habit of ignoring official medical conclusions. Kieran asks whether any of the three can still evolve. Ward says Ember definitely has an active growth pathway, though its destination is unknown. Vex has one too, but the route appears unstable and heavily shadow-lined. Atlas is more complicated because shell evolution requires structural continuity in most species. Kieran notices Atlas lower its head when Ward says that. Ward immediately changes tone and tells the tortoise that most species is not all species. Then he gives Kieran a far bigger problem. Evolution requires more than training if their cores are already reshaping around injuries. Each beast will eventually need an environment that pressures its adapted trait naturally. For Ember, that means controlled exposure to intense volcanic or ash-based energy. Kieran says the nearest legal volcanic zone is 3 weeks away and expensive. Ward points to a map hanging behind him instead. Ashwood Forest sits only 2 days east of the city. The Sundering turned its central region into a toxic fire biome centuries ago. Most tamers avoid the deeper zones because unstable ash storms scramble contract commands. Kieran looks at Ember. Ember is already staring at the map's red mark center. Ward warns that this is not permission to run into Ashwood tomorrow. Kieran says he would never do something that obviously reckless without supplies. Ward says the supplies are not the part of that sentence worrying him. Before Kieran leaves, Ward hands him a cheap heat reading lens and one warning. Do not chase evolution like a level up screen. If Ember's body changes before its mind is ready, evolution itself could kill it. He promises Ember will always get a choice. Ward refuses payment for the consultation, then charges Kieran heavily for 3 practical supplies anyway. The first is cooling paste designed for damaged fire channels around Ember's missing tail. The second is resonance chalk, capable of revealing weak essence movement across cracked surfaces. The third is a small tuning crystal that reacts whenever multiple soul signatures synchronize nearby. Ward calls the crystal mostly useless because modern contract marks drown subtle signals completely. Around Kieran's unmarked companions, however, the crystal gives a faint note almost every few minutes. Vex hates the sound and repeatedly tries stealing the crystal from Kieran's pocket afterward. Atlas appears fascinated by it and taps the case whenever the note changes pitch. Ember only reacts when Kieran experiences strong emotion, which may be the strangest pattern yet. On the walk home, evolution advertisements fill the Tamer district with impossible promises. One display guarantees rapid rank growth, and Ember's anxiety spikes through the bond. Kieran crosses the street rather than forcing it past another wall of expectations. At home, he studies every free Ashwood map and outdated ranger report available. The outer forest lists cindermites, ashfang jackals, toxic ash, and unstable vents. Deeper zones contain blank survey regions where contract interference becomes dangerously unpredictable. Vex keeps sitting over the tunnel routes while Atlas pushes its sealant kit toward Kieran. Ember never looks away from the red-marked inner burn zone on the map. Through their thread, Kieran feels something stranger than curiosity: faint recognition. That makes no sense for a salamander supposedly bred entirely inside city facilities. Kieran records the contradiction, but refuses to call it destiny or hidden bloodline yet. His plan is simple: earn money, train carefully, and gather evidence without chasing evolution. 3 days later, the guild posts triple-pay salvage work near Ashwood's outer burn line. The smart move is declining. The practical move pays weeks of medicine and tests. Ember's adaptation. Kieran accepts before common sense can win the argument. Accepting the Ashwood contract solves Kieran's money problem and creates 6 new ones. First, unlicensed handlers cannot enter corrupted zones without a registered escort team. Second, none of his beasts own certified resistance gear for toxic ash exposure. Third, Atlas still needs daily shell sealant that reacts badly to sulfur heat. Fourth, Vex hates travel cages and refuses every harness Kieran can afford. Fifth, Ember is visibly excited whenever Ashwood gets mentioned, which feels dangerous. And sixth, Kieran still has no legal explanation for commanding 3 uncontracted beasts. The guild pairs him with a licensed salvage team led by Captain Rowan Pike. Rowan is a broad-shouldered veteran with a scar cutting through one eyebrow. His contracted beast is Bristle, plated boar rated solid C rank. Scout Lena cross-studies Kieran's trio like a liability report. Healer Mason Greer looks curious instead. Lena uses a D-rank windkite and trusts clean data more than lucky improvisation. Mason travels with the Grove Lynx and checks injuries before he checks rank labels. When Rowan sees Kieran's companions, his expression becomes a full tactical complaint. He asks whether the guild accidentally assigned him a rescue mission disguised as labor. Kieran shows the warehouse clearances and recent performance records instead of arguing. Rowan scans the numbers, then looks at Atlas's cracked shell again. He says paper performance does not matter if Ashwood decides to throw a boss encounter. Kieran agrees and says avoiding boss encounters is currently the entire strategy. Rowan seems disappointed that sarcasm did not make him leave. The caravan departs before sunrise along the eastern road toward Ashwood. Verrett's capital shrinks behind them, while cultivated fields become gray scrubland. Old sundering scars appear farther east, black stone fused into unnatural glass veins. Ember spends most of the journey riding inside a padded basket near Kieran. It no longer fears being carried, but only when Kieran lets it climb in first. Vex travels beneath the wagon in moving shadow instead of inside any container. Rowan calls that unsafe until Vex appears beside a wheel before every pothole. Atlas walks slowly behind Bristle, matching the boar's pace without competition. Bristle initially snorts at the tortoise's damaged shell and tries bullying past. Atlas simply angles one plate, making the heavier boar slide sideways harmlessly. Rowan sees it happen and stops calling Atlas useless afterward. The first night, the caravan camps beside an abandoned watchtower outside Ashwood jurisdiction. Ward's heat lens shows Ember running warm despite the forest still being miles away. The salamander keeps facing east as if something inside the ash is calling. Mason crouches beside Ember, fascinated that its heat rises without obvious core damage. Lena warns that fascination gets people killed when Ashwood starts breaking normal rules. Kieran insists they are recovering research equipment, not chasing some miracle evolution. That night, he dreams of a vast winged shape moving beneath rivers of magma. A massive tail cuts through the glow before the vision suddenly disappears. Kieran wakes with Ember trembling against him and the soul thread pulsing faintly. Whatever that creature was, Ember recognized it before Kieran ever could. Morning brings the first clear view of Ashwood Forest. From a distance, it looks like an ocean of charcoal trees under red fog. Some trunks still burn internally without collapsing, glowing through cracks and bark. Black ash falls continuously despite the sky above being completely cloudless. Old warning pylons surround the outer boundary with glowing contamination marks. Rowan checks everyone's masks and distributes neutralizing tonic before crossing the line. Kieran fits Ember with a light throat wrap soaked in cooling mineral solution. The salamander immediately hates it and tries removing the cloth with both feet. Kieran loosens the wrap until Ember stops fighting instead of tightening it harder. Rowan notices and says obedience would make survival considerably easier inside Ashwood. Kieran says panic makes survival considerably harder, so they will meet halfway. The moment the team crosses the boundary, sound changes inside the forest. Wind seems muffled by thick ash hanging between the dead branches. Even Bristle lowers its head and stops making casual noise. Vex's ears rotate constantly, then flatten when distant heartbeats appear everywhere. Kieran feels a ripple through the soul thread before Vex gives any warning. Danger is not approaching. Danger is already around them. Rowan raises one fist and orders the caravan into a defensive diamond. Shapes move between burned trees, too low and fast for Lena's windkite. A pack of cinder mites erupts from the ash beneath the wagon wheels. Each insect is fist-sized, armored, and attracted to concentrated beast essence. Individually, they are weak. In a swarm, they can strip flesh faster than most low-rank fire attacks. Reload. Rowan orders Bristle to charge through the densest cluster. The plated boar tears a path open, crushing dozens under reinforced hooves. Lena's windkite creates a spinning gust that lifts another swarm upward. Kieran does not send Ember into the middle. He remembers Ember's heat limit and uses the insect's movement against them instead. Vex slips through the wagon's shadow and appears near a fallen tree. Kieran taps twice, their training signal for redirect rather than attack. Vex kicks Ash into the mites and pulls their aggro toward the log. Ember waits until the swarm compresses around one target zone. Then it releases one short crimson burst directly into the dry wood. The log ignites instantly, creating a rolling fire all across the insects. Kieran counts 3 seconds and signals Ember to stop before overheating begins. Ember cancels the flame even though dozens of mites remain active. That restraint is exactly what old trainers punished it for showing. Kieran rewards the choice by shifting Atlas forward to cover the cooldown. Atlas lowers its intact shell plate and lets the mites climb onto metal. Instead of crushing them, it pivots sharply beneath the wind. Kite's next gust. The insects get ripped from its shell and thrown straight into the fire line. Rowan watches the improvised combo while fighting another cluster with Bristle. He shouts that Kieran's rejects have annoyingly decent combat IQ. Kieran shouts back that he will put that on their business cards. The swarm finally breaks and disappears beneath the ash again. Mason checks everyone for bites while Ember pants beside Kieran's boot. Its body temperature remains high, but safely below the danger threshold. That matters more to Kieran than the number of mites burned. Rowan grudgingly admits the team can stay as long as discipline holds. Still skeptical, Lena is the first to spot something wrong near the disturbed nest. Several dead cinder mites have hollow core cavities despite being freshly killed. Something harvested their essence before the team ever arrived. Rowan says scavenger beasts sometimes eat cores and leave the shell behind. Mason's voice turns clinical as he points out cuts to precise for scavenger teeth. Kieran remembers Mara's warning about attention becoming ominous around unusual beasts. He files the discovery away, but says nothing about Apex because he knows nothing yet. The salvage coordinates lie another 6 miles through progressively hotter terrain. As the team travels, Ember's behavior becomes more alert with every mile. It stops panting despite rising ambient temperatures, which should be physiologically impossible. Ward's heat lens shows internal channels pulsing instead of simply storing excess energy. Kieran records the pattern in a pocket notebook between steps. Rowan teases him for doing homework inside a corrupted death forest. Kieran says homework never tried eating him, making this technically more exciting. By midday, the group reaches an old ranger station half buried under ash dunes. The missing research crate signal comes from somewhere below the collapsed structure. Atlas cannot fit through the narrow lower passage without worsening its shell fracture. Kieran asks Atlas to hold the entrance while Vex scouts inside. First, Vex disappears through a crack and sends back a faint emotional pulse moments later. Not danger, exactly. Fear. Kieran crawls into the passage, with Ember following close behind his shoulder. The basement smells of burned resin, blood, and something metallic beneath. Both. Vex waits beside a broken storage locker, staring into the rear darkness. Kieran's lamp catches a human boot first. Then it catches the rest of the body. A researcher lies against the wall with ash packed around an old wound. Mason squeezes through behind Kieran and immediately checks for breathing. The man is alive, barely, but his skin shows severe essence drain. His beast companion is nowhere nearby. The research crate sits open beside him, its internal sample racks completely empty. Kieran wakes the man long enough to ask what attacked the station. The researcher whispers that men in gray masks arrived before the predators did. They ignored equipment, money, and medicine. They only wanted beast cores and bloodline samples. When the research team resisted, the masked men released something into the basement. The survivor says one phrase before losing consciousness again. Apex takes the soul, not the body. Rowan's face hardens when Kieran repeats the words outside. Apparently Apex Syndicate is not just a rumor among veteran tamers. They are a black market network officially blamed for illegal evolution stimulants. Most reports connect them to poaching rare beasts and harvesting premium cores. Rowan has never heard of them stealing souls. Literally. Mason treats the survivor while Lena scouts for tracks around the ranger station. She returns with bad news almost immediately. Apex boots left hours ago, but fresh predator prints now circle the area. The tracks belong to Ashfang jackals, usually D-rank hunters traveling in coordinated packs. There are at least 12, far more than this zone normally supports. Together, something is driving predators toward the outer burn line. Rowan decides the salvage mission ends here because survival outranks contract payout. Kieran agrees without hesitation, which surprises Rowan after all his earlier stubbornness. They secure the wounded researcher onto the wagon and begin retracing their route. That should be the smart ending to Ashwood. Ashwood has other plans. Less than an hour late, Lena's wind kite suddenly drops from the canopy. A blackened quill is embedded through one wing membrane. Lena catches her beast and points upward with her free hand. Shapes begin moving along the burned branches on both sides of the trail. Ashfang jackals climb better than normal canine beasts due to hardened claw hooks. The first one drops directly onto Bristle's back before Rowan can pivot. Bristle bucks violently, throwing the jackal into a tree hard enough to crack bark. 3 more attack from opposite angles. Vex senses them first and sends panic through the soul thread network. Kieran feels the warning an instant before his eyes locate any target. He pulls Mason down as a quill passes exactly where the healer stood. Ember fires upward, but the angle forces a longer burn than usual. Kieran cuts the attack short before Ember's throat glow turns dangerously white. The jackal survives and lands behind Atlas. Atlas spins, placing the damaged side away from the predator automatically. Its front plate catches the bite while Kieran guides Vex toward the exposed flank. Vex slips through Atlas's shadow and kicks the jackal's rear leg sideways. The movement looks tiny, but it ruins the beast's balance completely. Ember follows with a point-blank burst to the chest. The first jackal drops. The remaining pack does not retreat. Their eyes glow with strange red veins that Rowan immediately recognizes as stimulant use. Somebody boosted these wild beasts artificially before driving them toward the trail. That means the attack may not be random at all. Rowan shouts for everyone to form around the wagon and protect the survivor. Bristle tanks the front, while Atlas covers the rear, despite its cracked shell. Lena's injured windkite provides intermittent gusts instead of sustained air control. Mason's Grove Link stays near the patient and detects incoming poison spikes. Kieran realizes his team must fill every gap the licensed party suddenly has. This is no longer a low-risk salvage job. It is their first real hunt against predators capable of killing them. And unlike warehouse rats, these things know exactly how to target weakness. The Ashfang pack attacks like a coordinated squad instead of wild scavengers. 2 jackals keep Bristle occupied while others probe the weaker rear formation. One deliberately feints toward Atlas's intact plate, then changes direction mid-lunge. The real strike slams into the crack center before Atlas can rotate fully. Metal tissue splits wider beneath the damaged shell, and Atlas grunts from pain. Kieran feels the impact through the soul thread like pressure inside his own ribs. He immediately pulls Atlas back instead of ordering another defensive stand. Rowan shouts that retreating the rear tank will expose Mason and the survivor. Kieran answers by pointing at a narrow rock channel beside the trail. If they funnel the jackals there, Atlas does not need to cover every angle. Rowan sees the geometry and changes formation without wasting time arguing. Bristle charges sideways, forcing the front attackers toward the channel entrance. Lena's wind kite produces one painful gust with its injured wing. The air blast drives loose ash into the jackal's glowing eyes. Vex uses the blindness window to cross between 3 separate shadows. Kieran cannot follow every movement visually anymore. He follows the emotional pulses instead, tracking Vex through shared instinct. The hare appears behind the pack leader and rakes its stimulant pouch loose. A glass capsule falls from the jackal's harness and cracks on stone. Rowan sees the equipment and curses because wild beasts do not wear dosing rigs. Someone fitted this entire pack before releasing them. Ember launches controlled bursts at the channel walls rather than the jackals directly. The heat causes brittle stone to crack and fall behind the advancing pack. Within seconds, the wide battlefield becomes a narrow killing lane. Atlas plants sideways at the lane mouth, with only its strongest plate exposed. Bristle stands beside it, turning the defensive line into layered armor. Now, the jackals must attack exactly where Kieran wants them. Ember fires in 3-second pulses over Atlas's lowered shell. Vex appears wherever a wounded jackal tries climbing the channel walls. Rowan's crew adds arrows, wind blades, and Bristle's crushing countercharges. For almost a minute, the team looks completely locked in. Then the stimulant inside the pack leader spikes. Its muscles swell beneath burned fur, and bone ridges tear through its shoulders. Mason identifies the reaction as a legal rage bloom, a short-lived forced enhancement. The drug can raise a D-rank predator toward C-rank output for several minutes. It also destroys the beast's core afterward, meaning whoever dosed it expected death. The pack leader launches over Atlas instead of hitting the defensive plate. Kieran sees the jump too late to move completely aside. Ember sees it first. The salamander leaps from the ground and spits flame directly into the jackal's face. The attack turns the predator mid-air, but one claw still catches Ember. A deep slash opens across the salamander's damaged rear side. Ember hits the stone hard beside Kieran and screams. For Kieran, the battlefield disappears beneath instant SOULBOUND feedback. He feels Ember's old tail wound and new injury overlap inside one memory. The sensation is identical to the moment that young Tamer pushed too far. Ember's internal temperature rockets upward from panic before Kieran can intervene. Its throat sac turns white, brighter than any training session ever reached. Rowan shouts for Kieran to make the beast fire before the heat cooks internally. Kieran knows the textbook answer would be exactly that. Dump the stored energy through the strongest attack possible. But Ember's memory tells him what forced output means to this beast. Kieran drops beside Ember while everyone else keeps fighting around them. He places one hand near the salamander without touching the injured tail region. Then he says Ember does not have to attack. The words sound insane during a pack assault. Kieran repeats them anyway. He tells Ember they can lose this fight and still leave together. No evolution is worth turning this moment into the old training room again. Ember trembles violently, fire leaking between its teeth and broken pulses. Kieran feels fear through the bond, then confusion beneath it. Nobody ever gave Ember permission to be too hurt to perform. The stored heat starts falling 1 degree at a time. Kieran keeps breathing slowly until Ember unconsciously matches the rhythm. Meanwhile, Atlas absorbs another glancing impact beside the channel entrance. Vex appears at Kieran's shoulder, checks Ember, then returns to the fight. The gesture lasts 1 second, but carries more concern than any command could. Rowan changes tactics to cover Kieran's team while Ember stabilizes. Bristle takes the front alone, and Lena starts dropping loose branches as barriers. Mason throws a flash tonic that blinds 2 stimulant-crazed jackals temporarily. Atlas tries to advance again despite its fresh shell injury. Kieran sends a sharp stop impulse through the soul thread without speaking. Atlas actually pauses. The response proves their connection is deepening under stress. Kieran signals Atlas to hold position and redirect instead of sacrifice. The tortoise lowers its head, unhappy, but obedient by choice. Vex then catches something none of the humans notice. Its ears turn east, away from the active pack, and its body stiffens. A much slower heartbeat is approaching through the forest. Every Ashfang jackal hears it moments later. The pack freezes mid-attack. Even the Rage Bloom leader stops snarling and turns toward the trees. Rowan immediately says anything scaring a stimulant pack is above their pay grade. The jackals retreat without retrieving their wounded. They disappear into the ash faster than the team can process the reversal. Silence returns to the channel for 3 seconds. Then a deep roar rolls through Ashwood and shakes ash from every branch. Bristle backs up instinctively until its armored flank touches Rowan's leg. Lena identifies the sound as an Ashmore Ravager from old ranger reports. Those beasts normally live near Ashwood's inner burn zone miles farther east. A mature Ashmaw can hit high C rank and briefly challenge low B rank defenses. Kieran looks toward the trail leading west and sees red fog thickening there. A second problem arrives before anyone can choose a direction. The ground beneath the western path erupts in a line of underground flame vents. A corrupted ash storm is forming across their only route back to the boundary. Rowan checks the pressure compass and swears again. The storm will make the west road lethal for at least several hours. Staying still leaves them exposed to the approaching Ashmaw. Moving east means heading deeper into the exact forest they plan to leave. Kieran asks whether the ranger station basement could serve as shelter. Mason says not with an unconscious patient and predators already tracking that scent. Lena points toward an old firebreak tunnel marked on the research map. The tunnel runs northeast beneath a basalt ridge and exits near a cooling basin. It is deeper, but underground stone could block both storm heat and Ravager tracking. Rowan hates the option, which makes it the current best option available. They load Ember into Kieran's coat sling because walking worsens the sidewound. Atlas refuses the cargo harness until Mason checks the widened shell fracture. Kieran presses his forehead briefly against Atlas's head and asks for one ride. The tortoise finally allows Rowan and Mason to secure it beside the survivor. Vex scouts ahead because darkness inside the tunnel favors its senses completely. The group reaches the firebreak entrance as the ash storm begins roaring behind them. Hot wind throws sparks sideways through the forest like glowing horizontal rain. The Ashmore roars again, closer now, and definitely following their route. Rowan seals the outer tunnel door after the wagon squeezes inside. The next impact hits metal from the outside. Seconds later, something huge scratches across the reinforced surface, but does not break through. For now, stone and old steel are enough. The tunnel goes dark after the storm destroys exterior power lines. Lena lights chemical lamps while Mason stabilizes Ember's wound first. The claw missed major organs but tore across the old scar network. That overlap explains the extreme panic and sudden core temperature spike. Mason cleans the cut while Kieran keeps Ember focused on his voice. The salamander snaps once when medicine reaches the deepest part. Kieran does not pull away completely. He lets Ember see the hand remain nearby without becoming another restraint. Eventually, Ember stops shaking and falls asleep against his wrist. Mason says the beast should avoid combat for at least 24 hours. Rowan says the storm may not care what medical recommendations prefer. Atlas's shell is worse. The fresh strike opened an older fracture nearly 2 inches farther across center plating. Mason can seal bleeding beneath the shell, but cannot restore structural integrity. Here, Atlas lowers its head again, clearly understanding the tone, if not every word. Kieran tells Atlas the same thing he told Ember. Nobody is earning points for dying correctly. If Atlas needs to hide behind Kieran for once, that is allowed. Rowan mutters that a human hiding a steel tortoise would be impressive physics. The joke earns the first weak smile since entering the tunnel. Vex returns from scouting with black dust covering its paws. It repeatedly taps one spot on the tunnel floor with a rear foot. Kieran lowers Ward's heat lens and sees a strange glow beneath cracked basalt. The ground carries threads of molten orange mineral, unlike normal firestone. Lena recognizes it as ashheart glass, rare condensed essence from sundering vents. The material forms only where corrupted flame cools under extreme pressure. Collectors pay huge money because fire-aligned beasts can absorb tiny, refined amounts. Unrefined ashheart is dangerous enough to rupture low-rank cores instantly. Kieran feels Ember stir inside his coat before the mineral is fully exposed. The salamander opens its eyes and stares directly at the glowing floor seam. A silver thread between them brightens hard enough for everyone nearby to notice. Rowan stops talking. Kieran asks if licensed contract bonds ever produce visible strands like that. Rowan says absolutely not, and takes one cautious step backward. Mason checks Ember's pulse and finds it accelerating without another temperature spike. The reaction is excitement, not panic. Kieran remembers Ward saying evolution requires environment, pressure, and mental readiness together. This looks suspiciously like the first ingredient arriving on its own. But Ember is injured and barely survived a trauma response 10 minutes ago. Kieran refuses to touch the ashheart glass while the beast is vulnerable. Instead, he marks the location and moves everyone deeper toward the cooling basin. Ember keeps looking back at the glowing seam until darkness hides it completely. The tunnel widens after half a mile into an abandoned maintenance chamber. Old pre-sundering pipes cross the ceiling, many still radiating faint residual heat. Rowan decides the chamber is defensible enough to wait out the ash storm. Lena sets trip lines near both entrances, while Vex maps side passages. Mason checks the unconscious researcher again and finally gets him stable. Kieran sits beside Ember and studies the wound through Ward's lens. Something strange is happening beneath the damaged tail scar. The rerouted thermal channels Ward described are glowing brighter than normal. Heat from Ashwood is not simply entering Ember's core. The energy seems to be tracing a new pathway around the missing tail. Kieran sketches the pattern and notices it resembles a curved spinal extension. He tries not to jump toward the obvious conclusion. Evolution hopes can become another kind of pressure if he is careless. Ember wakes fully and crawls from the sling, despite Kieran's protest. It takes 3 slow steps, winces, then looks toward the tunnel behind them. The direction leads back to the ashheart seam. Kieran tells Ember no. The salamander stares at him and takes one more step. Anyway, Kieran almost laughs, because voluntary soulbound apparently does not include free obedience. Then Ember touches its nose against his wrist. A memory flickers, much shorter than the first connection. Kieran sees the winged fire creature from last night's dream again. This time the creature turns, revealing a tail made from flowing molten rock. The image ends before Kieran can see its face. He realizes Ember was not dreaming randomly. The memory may come from somewhere deeper than the salamander's personal lifetime. Ward mentioned adapted bodies, but never inherited memory through a bloodline. Kieran now has a new theory and absolutely no safe way to test it. The ash storm howls through vents above them, making the decision temporarily irrelevant. They are staying underground until the western path opens again. For the next 2 hours, Ember refuses to stop watching the tunnel behind them. Waiting becomes its own kind of pressure when something large patrols outside. Every few minutes, the ashmoth scrapes claws across one of the tunnel entrances. The beast cannot locate them precisely, but it knows prey disappeared underground. Rowan rotates watch shifts while Lena tries repairing the wind kite's torn membrane. Kieran spends his shift listening to Ember's breathing instead of the tunnel door. The salamander remains awake, restless, and unusually focused despite the fresh wound. Eventually, Kieran places the ash heart sample question directly in front of it. He draws two choices in ash beside Ember, one toward the mineral seam. The other points toward the resting chamber and the safe route west. Afterward, Ember studies the crude drawing for several seconds. Then it deliberately walks onto the mark, pointing toward the ash heart glass. Kieran says wanting something is not enough reason to rush while injured. Ember scratches the same mark again, harder this time. The tiny argument attracts Rowan, who asks whether they are negotiating with Chalk now. Kieran explains the inherited memory flash and the unusual thermal pathway. Rowan says every sentence after inherited memory somehow gets more concerning. Mason is less dismissive because Ember's wound has already stopped active bleeding. Fire essence sometimes accelerates recovery in salamander species under controlled conditions. Unrefined ashheart is still too concentrated for direct absorption. Lena suggests extracting a dust-sized fragment rather than touching the full seam. Her salvage kit includes insulated forceps and an essence dilution vial. Kieran refuses to proceed until Ember chooses again after seeing the equipment. He places the closed vial beside the salamander and waits. Ember sniffs it, then pushes the vial toward the tunnel with its nose. Rowan sighs and says the beast may have more informed consent than guild rookies. They leave Mason with Atlas, the survivor, and the sealed western access. Kieran, Rowan, Lena, Ember, and Vex return toward the ashheart seam carefully. Vex travels ahead through darkness, detecting no large life signs nearby. At the glowing fracture, Lena chips away surrounding basalt without touching the mineral. The ashheart glass pulses like frozen lava under layers of black stone. Ember's throat sac answers with the same rhythm almost immediately. Kieran feels the silver thread tighten, not painfully, but with focused anticipation. Lena extracts a splinter smaller than a grain of rice into the dilution vial. Even that tiny fragment makes the glass container glow through insulated cloth. She mixes it with cooling salts and a neutral fire tonic slowly. The solution changes from molten orange toward dark amber as concentration drops. Mason's remote reader confirms the essence level is within F-rank tolerance. Theoretically. Rowan emphasizes the word theoretically like it personally offended him. Kieran kneels and places the vial between himself and Ember. He does not hold the beast or pour anything into its mouth. Ember approaches on its own and touches one claw against the glass. A memory bond pulse opens instantly. Kieran sees the winged creature again, standing inside an endless volcanic cavern. This time, 3 smaller salamanders crawl beneath its molten tail for protection. One has the same shortened tail shape Ember was born with. The great creature lowers its head toward that runt without rejection. Then the memory fractures into unfamiliar symbols and vanishes. Kieran returns to the tunnel, gasping, but Ember remains completely calm. He realizes the missing tail may not be a random defect at all. It could be a dormant ancestral trait misread by modern breeding standards. That theory is wild, but Verit's ranking system already missed Vex's shadow movement. Kieran uncaps the diluted vial and places one drop onto a stone plate. Ember sniffs the droplet, hesitates, then licks it voluntarily. Nothing happens for 3 seconds. Then crimson light runs down Ember's spine in one clean line. The salamander stiffens, but does not scream. Kieran feels heat rise through the bond without panic attached this time. A glowing ridge forms briefly above the missing tail scar, then fades again. The response stops before becoming a transformation. Lena checks the remaining solution and says the dose barely touched its potential. Kieran says good. A successful evolution test that does not nearly kill anyone counts as progress. Rowan finally admits that whatever Ember is, permanent F rank looks ridiculous now. They return to the maintenance chamber before the Ashmaw circles back again. For the next hour, Ember sleeps deeply while its core pattern keeps reorganizing. The forced rest gives Rowan enough time to finally ask how Kieran became Zero-Bond officially. Kieran expects mockery, but the veteran sounds more curious than judgmental after today's fighting. He explains the 6 failed resonance exams and the final empty reading at Crownspire. Rowan says an empty reading beside 3 responsive beasts sounds less like failure than bad calibration. Kieran says that theory arrived conveniently after years of everybody calling him soul dead. Lena asks whether memory bond lets him read thoughts whenever he touches a companion. Kieran corrects her immediately, because memories are not thoughts and consent changes everything. The first contacts happened accidentally, but he refuses to repeat them by force now. Mason says that distinction matters if Apex is truly extracting essence from living creatures. The conversation turns toward what modern contracts actually do beneath the Academy-approved language. Rowan admits battle marks always contain a compulsion layer for emergency override commands. Most tamers rarely notice because well-trained companions obey before the override ever activates. But the layer exists, and high-level military contracts can force movement through fear or pain. Kieran thinks about the young tamer pushing Ember through drills after the tail began burning. He asks whether a legal contract could technically make a beast keep fighting through injury. Rowan says yes, under emergency authority, although responsible tamers are supposed to avoid that. Ember stirs in its sleep at the answer, and the soul thread tightens automatically. Kieran lays one hand beside the salamander without initiating any deeper memory bond. The thread relaxes once Ember senses he is still there. Vex watches this from a dark pipe overhead, then drops silently beside Ember's blanket. The hair curls near Ember's front claws despite normally avoiding direct body contact. Atlas shifts closer from the opposite side, even though moving worsens its shell pain. Rowan goes quiet while watching three supposedly useless beasts form their own defensive cluster. He says his first instructor taught that loyalty is something a tamer earns after establishing control. Kieran answers that maybe the order is backward. The tuning crystal inside his pack suddenly produces a clear note instead of its usual faint hum. Everyone looks toward it. Ward said modern contract resonance should overwhelm that crystal, yet Rowan's bristle stands nearby too. Kieran removes the crystal and watches its surface point toward Ember, Vex, and Atlas together. The note strengthens whenever their breathing rhythms gradually align during rest. Lena whispers that the three beasts may be resonating with each other through Kieran's connection. Kieran thinks about the spontaneous combos during the Ashfang fight and realizes she may be right. The soul lattice does not have a name yet, but its earliest shape is already forming underground. That possibility feels exciting until another scrape echoes from the western tunnel door. The Ashmaw is still outside, and Ashwood refuses to let theory remain comfortable for long. Kieran pockets the crystal and focuses on one objective: everyone leaves alive. Kieran watches every reading and refuses to administer another Ashheart dose. The point is not speedrunning evolution. The point is surviving long enough for evolution to mean something. Near dusk, the ash storm outside finally begins weakening according to pressure sensors. Rowan estimates the western road will become passable within another 40 minutes. Relief spreads through the chamber until Vex suddenly bolts upright. Both ears point toward the western access door. The hare's soul thread hits Kieran with the pulse of immediate danger. Something is standing on the other side of the sealed entrance. Not the Ashmaw. This heartbeat is human. Then another appears beside it. And another. Rowan silently draws a short spear while Lena kills the chemical lamps. Metal scrapes outside as someone begins working the lock professionally. A calm voice says the door contains civilian survivors and should be opened peacefully. Rowan recognizes neither the voice nor any guild recovery code. Kieran thinks about the drained researcher and gray masks. Apex Syndicate may have doubled back for whoever survived their earlier raid. Rowan asks for identification through the door. The voice answers with an official ranger code that Lena knows was retired years ago. That confirms enough. Rowan orders everyone toward the eastern tunnel before the lock gives way. Mason secures the patient while Kieran wakes Ember carefully. Atlas stands despite pain and moves beside the wagon without being asked. Kieran tries putting Atlas back onto the harness to reduce shell strain. The tortoise refuses and positions itself between the group and western door. Kieran feels stubborn resolve through their bond. He compromises by ordering Atlas to stay beside Bristle instead of behind everyone. The lock snaps just as the wagon enters the eastern tunnel. Three figures in gray ash cloaks step into the dark maintenance chamber. Their masks carry a black triangle pierced by a silver fang. The instant Vex sees the silver fang, its entire body locks rigid. A chemical-scented spike of terror slams through Kieran's thread, then disappears before he understands it. Kieran has never seen the emblem before, but Rowan clearly has. Apex Syndicate. One operative spots the empty Ashheart vial and immediately follows the eastern route. The chase forces everyone deeper instead of allowing the planned retreat west. Rowan says the tunnel eventually exits near a geothermal basin inside mid-Ashwood. That zone is absolutely outside the salvage team's contract clearance. Kieran answers that Apex probably does not care about paperwork boundaries. They move quickly despite Atlas's pain and the patient's unstable condition. Behind them, controlled footsteps stay exactly far enough away to avoid ambushes. Apex is not rushing. They are hurting the group somewhere. Vex senses movement ahead and sends another warning pulse. Kieran realizes the Ashmaw's heartbeat now waits near the eastern tunnel mouth. The predator never left. The group is trapped between a high C-rank beast and human poachers. Rowan stops the wagon before the exit and studies the stone walls desperately. No side passage is wide enough for Atlas or Bristle. Fighting Apex in the tunnel risks exposing the wounded researcher behind them. Fighting the Ashmaw outside risks everyone else immediately. Kieran looks down at Ember and notices the salamander staring toward daylight. The crimson line along its spine has returned stronger than before. Ashheart energy inside the core is reacting to the geothermal basin ahead. Kieran hates the timing because evolution should not happen under forced combat pressure. Ember feels his fear through the bond and nudges his wrist once. The gesture says something different from the earlier panic. Not "I have to fight," more like "I want to stay." Kieran understands the distinction, but still refuses to gamble Ember's life casually. He asks Rowan whether the Ashmaw can be redirected instead of killed. Rowan says, maybe, if someone gives it a better target than wounded humans. Kieran looks back toward the advancing Apex operatives. That is the first strategy today. That sounds almost fun. They position Bristle and Atlas beside the eastern doorway without exposing the wagon. Lena repairs enough of the wind kite's wing for one strong directional gust. Vex hides inside the tunnel shadows where Apex cannot detect its exact position. Kieran carries Ember near the exit, but keeps the salamander behind his body. The first Apex operative rounds the bend and sees the improvised formation. He tells Rowan to surrender the survivor and any anomalous beast samples collected. Rowan asks whether anomalous includes a salamander with terrible customer service. The operative ignores him and deploys a black contract chain from his wrist. A hulking bone hyena materializes from a capture sphere beside him. Its eyes are empty, gray, and metal staples run along both shoulders. Kieran feels Ember recoil at the smell of forced enhancement instantly. A second operative releases 2 wire vipers modified with control collars. The third remains behind them, carrying a long rifle built for beast cores. These people are equipped to capture creatures, not simply kill witnesses. Kieran suddenly realizes they may be interested in Ember after sensing Ashheart resonance. The lead operative confirms it by pointing directly at the salamander. He says the defective fire specimen is worth more alive if its core mutated. Ember freezes. Defective. The word hits the bond harder than Kieran expects. A memory flashes of breeders saying the same thing above a hatchling tray. Kieran steps completely in front of Ember and tells Apex to find another specimen. The operative says attachment is why amateur tamers never reach high rank. Then he orders the bone hyena forward. Rowan counters with Bristle and the tunnel explodes into close-range combat. The boar meets the hyena head-on, armored skull against reinforced bone. Atlas shifts beside Bristle, redirecting 1 wire viper strike off its good plate. Vex emerges behind the second viper and tears the control collar cable partially loose. The beast convulses when the damaged collar sends a punishment shock through its neck. Kieran feels sick watching the reaction. Apex is not bonding with these creatures. They are piloting them. The lead operative yanks his contract chain and forces the hyena to attack harder. Bristle starts losing ground beneath the unnatural output. Kieran signals Lena. The wind kite releases its saved gust directly through the eastern doorway. Hot basin air blasts inward, carrying the scent of the Ashmaw waiting outside. Then Kieran throws the crack stimulant capsule taken from the jackal pack outward. The chemical scent lands on the Apex lead operative's cloak as planned. 1 heartbeat passes. The Ashmaw erupts through the doorway like a walking furnace with jaws. It is massive, bear-shaped, and armored in charcoal plates split by orange heat. The beast smells the stimulant and immediately targets the nearest contaminated figure. The Apex formation collapses as the lead operative dives aside. Rowan shouts for everyone to move while predator and poachers collide. The wagon surges into the geothermal basin behind Bristle. Atlas limps beside it. Vex crosses from shadow to shadow beneath exposed basalt arches. Kieran carries Ember until the salamander starts fighting his grip. He puts Ember down because choice still matters even during chaos. They sprint across steaming ground toward the basin's northern ridge. For several seconds, the plan works beautifully. Then the Ashmaw hurls the bone hyena through the tunnel wall behind them. Stone explodes outward and blocks the Apex operatives from immediate pursuit. Unfortunately, the Ashmaw also turns toward Kieran's group afterward. It has found easier prey. Rowan says they are officially out of clever plans. Kieran looks at the basin ahead and sees rivers of glowing mineral-cutting escape routes. The Ashmaw begins charging. The Ashmaw's first charge makes every previous predator look like tutorial mobs. Its front claws tear trenches through basalt, while heat rolls off its armored shoulders. Rowan orders Bristle to draw left while everyone else runs toward higher ground. Bristle slams the Ravager's flank and barely changes its direction. The Ashmaw swats once, sending the C-rank boar tumbling across steaming stone. Rowan feels the impact through his contract and nearly drops beside it. Mason pulls him upright while the Grove Lynx races toward injured Bristle. Lena's windkite dives low, cutting ash across the Ashmaw's face. The distraction buys 3 seconds, maybe 4. Atlas plants itself between the predator and the wagon without waiting for Kieran. Kieran feels the same bridge memory resolve flare through their soul thread. He shouts for Atlas to angle right instead of taking the charge center mass. The tortoise obeys at the last possible instant. The Ashmaw clips the strongest shell plate instead of hitting the central fracture. Even redirected, the force throws Atlas several feet sideways. A fresh crack flashes across one rear plate. Kieran's chest tightens with reflected pain through the bond. Atlas tries standing immediately. Anyway, Kieran sends a hard stop impulse and physically puts himself beside the tortoise. He says this is not the bridge, and nobody is trapped behind Atlas anymore. The tortoise hesitates long enough for Vex to create another opening. Vex slips beneath the Ravager's shadow and appears beside its rear leg. The hair strikes a glowing joint where charcoal armor plates separate naturally. It cannot damage the beast deeply, but the surprise makes the leg buckle. Rowan uses that stumble to drag Bristle out of the direct attack lane. Kieran scans the basin for terrain that could compensate for the rank gap. A narrow mineral shelf crosses above one steaming magma runoff channel. If the Ashmaw breaks that shelf, superheated vapor could blind it temporarily. Kieran directs Vex toward the shelf while signaling Lena to attack from above. Vex becomes the bait, flashing in and out of shadows beneath the Ravager's jaw. The Ashmaw snaps repeatedly, growing angrier each time Vex disappears. Kieran hates using Vex as bait, but feels no fear coming through the bond. Vex is focused, calculating, and somehow enjoying the monster's frustration. The hair leads the Ashmaw beneath the basalt shelf exactly as intended. Lena's windkite fires a compressed blade into a visible fracture overhead. Nothing happens. The shelf is thicker than the scout expected. The Ashmaw turns toward Vex before Lena can strike again. Ember suddenly spits a crimson burst into the same fracture line. Heat expands trapped moisture inside the rock instantly. The shelf explodes downward in a shower of black stone and white steam. The Ashmaw roars as vapor floods its face and sensitive heat vents. For one glorious moment, the entire team gets a clean escape lane north. Kieran tells everyone to run instead of wasting time dealing damage. This fight is not about winning. It is about keeping every companion alive long enough to leave Ashwood. They race toward the northern ridge while the Ashmaw claws through falling stone. Ember keeps pace for 20 yards before its injured side suddenly gives out. The salamander collapses and rolls across hot gravel. Kieran doubles back immediately. The Ashmaw breaks free from steam behind them much faster than expected. Rowan shouts that Kieran has maybe 10 seconds before it reaches them. Kieran scoops Ember up and starts running with the beast against his chest. Ember sees the predator closing over Kieran's shoulder. Its throat begins glowing again. Kieran feels panic surge through their thread, identical to the earlier trauma spike. Ember twists in his arms, trying to turn toward the approaching threat. The stored heat rises dangerously fast. Kieran stops running. Everyone else screams at him to move. Instead, he sets Ember down behind a basalt pillar and kneels beside it. He says no. Ember stares at him like the word makes no sense. During certain death, Kieran says they are not doing this because somebody needs a stronger monster. They are not proving Crownspire wrong, and they are not earning any rank. If Ember is scared, then they run scared together. If its body cannot fight, then Kieran will carry it until his legs fail. But he will never turn pain into a command again. The Ashmaw's footsteps shake loose stones around them. Kieran reaches toward Ember, then deliberately leaves his palm open instead. Choice. That is the only thing he can offer better than every tamer before him. Ember looks at the hand. Then it looks at Kieran's face. The soul thread ignites silver-white between them. Kieran falls into memory bond deeper than ever before. He sees the breeding room, the failed drills, and the severed tail again. But now, the memories keep moving past the injury instead of stopping there. He sees nights inside cages where Ember imagined someone opening the door. He sees the moment Kieran actually did. He sees the ashfish left beside the stove with no test. Afterward, he sees the storm night where nobody demanded courage from frightened beasts. He sees every training session where stopping early counted as success. For one heartbeat, something travels back through the bond toward Ember. Not a memory or scene. Only the Reich Kieran still carries from Crownspire. Ember feels humiliation, loneliness, and the terror of being left behind again. Kieran senses the salamander recognize those emotions without knowing their full history. That tiny emotional echo is enough to change the shape of their connection. For the first time, their fear belongs to neither of them alone. The bond settles around one shared truth between them. Neither of them wants to be abandoned again. The ashmore rounds the basalt pillar. Kieran reaches for Ember, ready to run, even if they cannot outrun anything. Ember steps past his hand instead. Not because Kieran commanded it. Because the salamander chooses the battlefield for itself. The crimson line along Ember's spine erupts brighter than molten metal. Every trace of ashheart essence inside its core activates at once. Heat from the geothermal basin rushes inward through the rerouted channels. Kieran feels the energy building and almost tries stopping the process. Then Ember sends one clear emotional pulse through the soul thread. Trust me. Kieran has never received actual words through the bond before. Maybe it is not language at all, but the meaning is unmistakable. He takes one step back. Ember roars, and the sound no longer belongs to something small. Scar tissue around the missing tail begins glowing from beneath the scales. Instead of reopening, the damaged base extends in a stream of liquid magma. A new tail forms where biology said nothing could ever regrow. Its shape hardens around a molten core, longer than Ember's original body. The salamander's spine arches as crimson plates rise along its back. Forelegs lengthen, claws darken, and shoulder bones spread beneath heated scales. Two membranes burst outward from the upper back through showers of sparks. They unfold into short wings edged with glowing magma veins. Ember's body grows until Kieran has to step back twice more. The transformation does not erase the old scar. The scar becomes the anchor holding the molten tail together. That detail hits Kieran harder than the size change itself. The thing everyone called defective just became the center of evolution. Heat explodes outward, but this time it moves with control instead of panic. Ember lands on four heavier limbs and lifts a horned, wyvern-like head. The new creature stares down the ashmaw without a trace of cage-born fear. Kieran's heat lens instantly overloads and shuts itself off. The cheap device displays one final message before dying completely. Rank error. Rowan sees it and asks whether Kieran just evolved an F rank mid-disaster. Kieran says now would be a fantastic time to discuss that later. The ashmaw charges again, treating the new form as a fresh territorial threat. Ember does not meet it head-on. Kieran feels battle intent through the bond before seeing the movement. The magma wyvern leaps sideways and beats its unfinished wings once. The burst is not enough for sustained flight, but it changes momentum instantly. The ashmaw overshoots by several feet. Ember's molten tail whips across the Ravager's exposed rear joint. The strike melts stimulant scar tissue and sends the larger beast stumbling. Vex appears beside Ember with both ears high and ready. Atlas forces itself upright farther back, refusing to miss the next exchange. Kieran sends one shared impulse across all three soul threads. Not attack. Together, Vex draws the ashmaw's attention toward the steaming runoff channel again. Atlas moves to the channel's narrow edge and braces at a safe angle. Ember circles opposite them, heating one basalt plate under the Ravager's feet. The ashmaw lunges after Vex and steps onto the softened stone. Its front leg sinks several inches as the surface collapses beneath its weight. Atlas hits from the side, not to damage, but to shift balance. The tortoise's angled shell turns the trapped leg into a leverage point. The ashmaw crashes onto one shoulder. Ember moves before the predator can recover. A concentrated magma beam forms between its jaws, instead of scattered flame. Kieran feels how much power is available, and how carefully Ember controls it. The blast strikes the Ravager's outer armor, melting a glowing line across plates. Ember stops after 3 seconds on its own. That voluntary cutoff proves the evolution did not erase their training. The ashmaw tries rising, but Vex attacks the same weakened joint again. Bristle returns beside Rowan for one final charge. Despite its bruised armor, Rowan checks with the boar instead of forcing the command. Bristle snorts once and lowers its head willingly. The licensed tamer seems to learn something from Kieran in that tiny pause. Bristle slams the exposed shoulder while Atlas redirects from the opposite side. The Ashma rolls into the shallow runoff channel with a violent hiss of steam. Kieran expects Ember to finish it immediately. The magma wyvern raises its head, then looks back at him first. Their eyes meet across the basin. Kieran feels no hunger for revenge through the soul thread. Only a question. He lowers his hand. The Ashma is beaten, injured, and no longer blocking their escape. Ember steps backward instead of executing it. The Ravager drags itself from the channel and retreats toward deeper Ashwood. Nobody speaks for several seconds afterward. Then Rowan says Crownspire can shove permanent F rank directly into a furnace. Kieran laughs harder than the joke deserves because everyone is still alive. Ember turns toward him, suddenly looking unsure inside its much larger body. Kieran walks forward slowly and places one hand against its heated snout. The scales are warm enough to sting, but not burn him. A calmer memory bond pulse flows between them without dragging either mind under. For the first time, the connection feels like a door they can open gently. Kieran names the new form Magma Wyvern until researchers identify something better. Ember chirps, but the sound comes out as a chest-deep rumble. Now, Vex freezes for 1 second, then jumps onto Ember's back like nothing changed. Atlas bumps one armored foreleg against the new molten tail carefully. The three rejected beasts recognize each other before any human label catches up. The emotional payoff lasts exactly long enough for Rowan to remember Apex exists. The tunnel behind them remains blocked by the Ashma's earlier impact. Gray-masked operatives will eventually find another route around the ridge. Rowan orders immediate evacuation north through the cooling basin trail. Ember insists on walking despite the evolution consuming enormous core energy. Kieran compromises by letting it carry no weight and stopping every 10 minutes. The journey out takes hours because they avoid every detectable predator territory. Vex scouts constantly, while Atlas rides beside the rescued researcher when necessary. Near midnight, they finally cross an emergency ranger beacon outside corrupted boundaries. Guild rescue teams arrive after receiving Lena's delayed signal burst. The exhausted group reaches civilization looking like they lost a raid and won. Kieran sleeps nearly 14 hours beside Ember in a field clinic recovery bay. Clinic staff try moving Ember to a separate ward. It anchors molten claws until Kieran follows. Vex sleeps beneath that cot where bright medical lights cannot reach the damaged eye directly. Atlas occupies half the recovery corridor because no standard treatment stall fits the cracked shell. Despite everything, the three companions settle only after confirming Kieran remains within sight or scent. News from Ashwood spreads through guild channels before Kieran even wakes the first time. A low-quality rescue clip shows a tiny salamander becoming something winged inside a wall of fire. Another user zooms in on Kieran's bare wrist and asks why no contract mark appears anywhere. That question gets deleted 3 times, then reposted across separate hunter boards within an hour. When he finally wakes, Ember is staring through the window at its own reflection outside. The magma wyvern tilts its head, clearly still adjusting to a body several times larger. It tries curling into the tiny shape once used beneath Kieran's stove, and fails completely. Kieran laughs until Ember gives him an offended rumble through the soul thread. The comedy matters because evolution did not magically erase fear, pain, or ordinary adjustment. Ember still flinches when strangers approach the tail scar too quickly during examination. Kieran makes every technician announce contact first and waits for Ember's body to relax. Each successful inspection ends without sedatives, restraint straps, or defensive flames. For once, a system is adapting around the beast instead of demanding the opposite. And nobody inside realizes Apex analysts are studying the same footage for completely different reasons. Ward arrives before noon and stops dead beside the magma wyvern. Ward checks the new tail first and starts laughing like a scientist losing sanity. The structure is not regenerated flesh. It is stabilized thermal essence anchored directly through Ember's old scar network. In plain language, the missing tail did not get fixed. Ember evolved around the fact that it was missing. Ward runs 3 rank scanners and receives 3 incompatible readings. One says high D rank, another spikes briefly into C rank, and one simply errors. None recognizes Magma Wyvern as a registered evolution branch of Fire Salamander. Mara arrives from Crownspire after Rowan files the incident report. Then she asks Kieran what he fed the beast. Kieran says one diluted ash heart drop, a lot of bad decisions, and basic respect. Mara ignores the joke and asks whether the transformation followed forced resonance. Ember chose to fight after being given permission not to fight. Mara looks at the silver thread visible briefly between them and goes pale. She says old SOULBOUND texts describe evolution triggered by reciprocal acceptance. Modern scholars dismiss those passages as symbolic mythology for generations. The soul thread now connects Ember to Vex and Atlas indirectly through him. Their party is becoming a network, not three separate ownership relationships. Ward calls the pattern a soul lattice and immediately starts taking notes. Ward says the term appears only once in a damaged pre-sundering fragment. Before the argument grows, Rowan arrives carrying the recovered Apex stimulant capsule. Guild analysts traced its maker's mark to black market labs connected with Apex Syndicate. More disturbing, residue inside matches the hollowed cindermite cores from Ashwood. Apex is not merely poaching beasts. They are extracting essence from living cores and using it to force other beasts upward. The rescued researcher confirms Apex kept asking about dormant bloodlines inside low-rank species. They believed modern rank screens were missing ancient evolutionary branches. Kieran looks at Ember, and every person in the room reaches the same conclusion. Apex may have been searching for exactly what Ember just proved exists. The warning comes too late anyway. Across the city, someone has already purchased the Ashwood rescue footage anonymously. The recording shows Ember transforming beside Kieran before the Ashmaw battle. A gray-masked analyst freezes the frame where the silver soul thread becomes visible. He enlarges the image and compares it with the symbol from an ancient file. The match is nearly perfect. A woman steps from the darkness behind him, wearing Apex's silver fang insignia. Her name is Nira Kane, field commander of Apex retrieval operations. She asks whether the boy formed a conventional contract before the evolution. The analyst says there is no registered soul mark anywhere on Kieran Voss. Nira watches Ember's transformation again from the beginning. Then she asks about the other two rejected beasts traveling with him. Their files appear beside Ember's, both stamped permanent F rank by Crownspire. Vex, Shadow, unknown lineage. Atlas, steel tortoise, damaged evolutionary pathway. Nira smiles when she sees all three came from the same rejected disposal wing. She says Crownspire accidentally stored 3 lottery tickets in a trash bin. The analyst asks whether Apex should capture the magma wyvern immediately. Nira says no. If the boy can unlock dormant pathways, forcing him early would waste valuable data. They will watch what he does with the shadow hair and steel tortoise next. Then they will take the beasts after the method becomes repeatable. Back at the clinic, Kieran believes Ashwood's danger ended at the boundary line. He sits between Ember, Vex, and Atlas, while city lights glow beyond the window. 3 weeks ago, Crownspire said none of them had a future worth funding. Now, one has evolved beyond the Academy's registered chart completely. Vex still carries a blind eye, and secrets Kieran cannot read yet. Atlas still carries a broken shell that every doctor calls an evolutionary dead end. Kieran looks at both beasts and remembers Ward's question from before Ashwood. Fixable might be the wrong question. Maybe broken things do not need to become their old shape again. Outside, far above the clinic, a surveillance drone turns toward the window silently. Its camera locks onto the 3 silver soul threads around Kieran. Apex has found the anomaly, and this time, the monsters they want are choosing their own tamer.